Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and what is a bit of a lighter week to give you a bit of a break to go and listen to some other podcasts and watch some other things. Just 3 shows this week, and then next week we have Tank Destroyer Week. We have had a few new viewers come in since the 8th Air Force Week last week. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click subscribe and the little bell so you receive notifications. And always, the information you need about my guests, their books, their social media links is in that description below. So don't forget to use that. That's a resource for you. But my guest today is Iain Ballantyne. He's a military historian and the editor of Warships International Fleet Review, and he's here to talk about HMS London. So I'll bring Iain in now. So good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right. You all right?
I'm very well. So we're here because HMS London is out in paperback now.
Yeah.
You wrote it coming on for 20 years ago. So before we bring in the subject and talk about the ship and the history, any changes to the book in the 20 years? Anything you've learned? Any new startling information, or is it a kind of just a reshuffling of images?
Well, the book, one of the major parts of the book was the HMS London that I went to Russia aboard in 1991, right, which was a Cold War Type 22 anti-submarine frigate. And so what I did was I refreshed the end chapters of the book, which are about that ship, and brought it right up to date with what she's doing now in the Romanian Navy in the Black Sea, and also the Ukraine War, and how the trip in 1991, which was to commemorate the Arctic convoys of World War II, has turned around from the end of the Cold War between the Soviet, it was the Soviet Navy then, and the Royal Navy, happened in August 91. But then, 30 years later, more than 30 years later, we're back in that confrontation. So the whole idea of the book was to bring it all around full circle, and here we are again with the confrontation with Russia. And also there's going to be a new HMS London, which will be an anti-submarine warfare frigate. So I did a whole chapter on that, and I added in some extra bits, including appendices on World War II and an old fighting sail London whose wreck is in the Thames. So I bookended it with new stuff, a new intro, and we changed some of the pictures as well, put in some new World War II images. But the narrative about the London of World War II and the history of the ship goes back to the 17th century, is that it's about a cruiser which saw a lot of service on the Arctic convoys and then out in the Far East. So that's the same. That's still the core of that part of the book.
And you're going to take us through that history there, because I was just saying to you before going live, we don't do much about individual ships, or in this case your book is about the various ships with the same name. When we do talk about the Navy actions, it's more about campaigns. We talk about them as fleets meeting each other in wherever it will be, off the coast of Guadalcanal we covered recently, or the Arctic convoys. So it's interesting to have a slightly different show, folks. So we will do questions at the end today if they're big ones, technical ones, but if there's anything really pressing about something that's on screen, we'll do that as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to Iain to take us through a kind of a potted history of HMS London, the war years, but we're breaking a World War II TV rule, and we are going up to 1949. So because it would be silly to have Iain on and not cover the history that some of you will be familiar with and a few of you won't be in 1949. So over to you, Iain, and I'll try and keep where you are with the various slides. So start at the beginning.
Okay. Well, I mean, the London of World War II was a county-class cruiser, ordered in 1925, launched in 1927. And as I've already mentioned, it was a name that went back all the way to the 1630s. And so there were Londons that fought in the Civil War, the English Civil War, the American War of Independence, in the Crimean War, and as a pre-dreadnought in the First World War, in the Channel Fleet, and then supporting the Dardanelles campaign. So when the Royal Navy was looking to rebuild after the First World War, there were various limitations put on the construction of battleships and other vessels, and cruisers were limited too. And so in the late 1920s, as part of their allocation of tonnage, the British decided that they would have a series of county-class cruisers, which would be fast and large and armed with 8-inch guns. And London was one of those. And it's a name that earned its place, I guess, because of the British capital, named after the British capital, built at Portsmouth, and had a displacement of 9,850 tons, 13,315 full load, and was about 630 odd feet long. So completed in early 1929, which means ready to actually start sea trials. By the late 1930s, London was the flagship of the first cruiser squadron in the Mediterranean and had been on the Spanish neutrality patrol, trying to keep the peace between the warring factions in the Spanish Civil War, and rescued thousands of people from Barcelona out of the way of the fighting. So as what they call grey diplomats, or peacekeeping ships, if you like, and protecting trade and doing all those various workhorse things for Britain around the world. That's what cruisers were for. And then when it became clear that Britain would have to rearm to face down the Nazi threat, the German threat, in the late 1930s, they decided that they would try and rebuild the county-class cruisers. And the one they picked for that, and in fact London became the only one, was HMS London, and she was converted and rebuilt at Chatham. And it wasn't a terribly great success, because what they did was they strained the design by putting an armor belt, lots of new armament and various other things into the ship. And it meant that throughout the war, she would suffer from leaks and also other problems in her structure. But that took quite a while to do. And so by the time she finished her major rebuild and refit at Chatham, London was then 11,000 standard tons and about 14,500 tons full load. And she came out to join the home fleet of the Royal Navy in February, March 1941.
Brilliant. And just for a complete novice like myself, when we're talking about the 1930s, we've talked about tank development, we've talked about aviation technology. The cruiser class, as you said there, their job was kind of a pre-war job. So as soon as you said that, I was thinking of kind of those pre-war territorial infantry regiments that are out there, where they're almost serving as kind of police forces, and then suddenly this modern war comes, and maybe they're experienced in soldiery, but they're not perhaps experienced in the types of warfare. You write about the Navy today, then all around. In this case, the cruiser class, were they really ready for a modern naval warfare in 1939-40, or were they sort of a stopgap, just find the best role for them? How would you define kind of their readiness?
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely a role for them. I mean, the cruisers were integrated with the battle fleet as the scouting forces, the shadowing forces, which they did during World War II. So they would be risked, if you like, because they had high speed and they could dodge, enemy battleship shells if they were shadowing them. And they had aircraft like the Walrus there to act as scouts to look for the enemy battle fleet. So the Royal Navy throughout the interwar year, and it still does this to this day, it always trains and rehearses. And the commanders of the fleets had a lot of experience in the First World War and things like the involvement in the Baltic, which happened with Britain's Navy in the 1920s. So the ships themselves, I would say, were getting old and fairly antiquated compared to what, let's say, the Americans were building by this time, and probably even the Italians. But the people, I would say, were pretty sharp and well trained. So they knew that when war came, these vessels would be the ones that would go out and patrol, as she's doing there, as London's doing there, the Atlantic, or up in the seas around Iceland, to watch the exit routes for German battleships and other high seas raiders. So they knew what their role would be. And in fact, London, as you see her there in the Atlantic by summer 1941, was out there escorting a convoy, because they would switch roles whenever required. So London in May 1941, was escorting a convoy, and the Bismarck, the German battleship Bismarck, broke out, destroyed Hood, and then broke out into the Atlantic. And so London, like many ships in the Royal Navy dispersed across the Atlantic, was sent to try and connect with the Bismarck after she disappeared from the Royal Navy's other scouting cruisers, because they lost track of her. So London was involved in that, but actually her most intriguing, interesting job came after that, when she was sent to destroy the supply vessels that were meant to work with Bismarck and the U-boats. So they that fairly absorbing task was helped by some of the code breaking as well, trying to find out where these supply ships could be lurking. Because if you destroy the supply ships, then obviously you hamper and curtail whatever a U-boat can do at long distance, because it has no supplies, and the same applies to a high seas raider. So that was really her first involvement after that major rebuild in doing anything active, and London actually played a role in causing the sinking of 3 of those supply vessels in the Atlantic.
And as we've always thought about on the channel, logistics, which is supplies, is so important. And to take on the Kriegsmarine and the Italian Navy globally, it's not just about main battleships shooting each other or carriers. It's about supplies. It's about logistics. It's about affecting the ability of the enemy to get their material to another battlefield, to fuel their ships, to get their ships supplied, etc., etc. And so, when we consider the naval battle, it's yes, ships, firing their guns at each other is very exciting and glamorous. But of course, the job of a modern navy to prevent the enemy's navy doing their job involves all sorts of things. And you said there, I'm picking up what you said. If a ship is fast, that's always going to carry it through to some extent, isn't it? If you're slow but up to date technology, that's one weakness, strength. But if you're fast and nippy and your crew is flexible, you can do different things. It seems to me that that's the cruiser class have this ability to kind of be jack of all trades in some ways.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, one of the things that attracted me, apart from my own personal association with the last HMS London, going aboard her to Russia, what I found with warships in meeting the various crews and people around the world when I visited them on the front line, and that's a picture of London in her Arctic camouflage after the rebuild, as you can see, very blocky looking, is that they're like regiments, and they have the esprit de corps of that, and the name carries that. But London's an interesting name during the centuries in which there was a London warship. The vessel was associated with triumphs and disasters, but actually in exactly what you're talking about, the routine protection of trade, or the escorting of convoys or other things, safeguarding the sea lane. So London is kind of the epitome of that, with a few spikes of controversy or incident across her history. And in fact, when it came to Britain, thinking the Russians are about to come into the war, having helped the Germans in the first bit, with Hitler's invasion of Russia, it was clear that a way of helping Britain was to help Russia. So in fact, HMS London, the cruiser, was chosen in September 1941 to take Lord Beaverbrook and other VIPs and top brass to Archangel in northern Russia, in the Arctic, to drop them off, and they would go to Moscow and have discussions with Stalin and his team, as it were, and decide how Britain could help with escorting convoys around the top that would become known as the Kola Run to Murmansk and Archangel. And while London was waiting for Beaverbrook and the others to come back, she actually went and helped escort the first convoy. It was a return convoy, part of the way, and German bombers were actually trying to find them at the time, but thanks to mist, didn't manage it. So that was a milestone for her history in terms of convoys. And in fact, convoy work was something, patrolling in the Arctic was one of the main things that she did, and in terrible seas, which often drove her sailors and Marines to the edge of despair, to be honest.
Which is going to dovetails nicely to this photo there, because there are the rivet counters who are obsessed about the length of ships and the armament and the grade of that and the specifications of this. But at its heart, when you get to the Arctic in World War II, it is a human story, and one of endurance and it states the obvious: freezing cold, freezing weather, freezing seas. Every job being made that much harder. We did the show with John McKay last year about the personnel on those ships. So this is when a ship is its people or her people rather than the actual structure itself. So in your research in the book, just how difficult was it being on a ship in the Arctic in 41, 42, 43?
It was very difficult. I mean, I interviewed because I wrote the book. The core of the book 20 years ago this year it came out. I was lucky enough to actually interview sailors, ratings, and some of the junior officers that served in the book, so I got a very good feeling for that, and I corresponded with them as well. And so they told me about the certainly during the winter, you know, the terrible conditions they would face. I mean, these ships were not kept spick and span like a normal warship would be in the Royal Navy, what they call Pusser's standards, which means top discipline and cleanliness.
Yeah.
They were covered in vomit and rust. And people in the Royal Navy, you see it in movies where they, and also TV programs, where they have their number one uniforms on. They didn't wear number one uniforms. They wore just overalls, and they were grimy, and they wore woolly hats and all the rest of it. And they had to go out onto the upper deck, as you said, and steam clean all the ice off the upper deck, or the ship would capsize. And then it was very, very difficult to combat seasickness and the mental strain. I mean, you could see some of the guys there enjoying having a fag with their typical sailors' outfits on. But there were people who were like grizzled old salts, like some of the chefs, the cooks, and also some of the engineer officers. And one of the guys I spoke to was one of the cooks, and he said that not once did he ever fail to get a meal done. Difficult though it was, with like pans and pots flying everywhere and scalding water going everywhere, and the ship, you know, even a big ship like a cruiser like London being hurled around. Not once did he fail to get a meal to them. But that guy had an amazing ability to stay upright in the warship. And then there was another guy who was a senior engineer down in the engine room, whom one of the ratings, junior ratings that I later interviewed 50 odd years later, he said that he watched this man stand where the center of gravity was down in the ship in one of the engine rooms, basically with his hands behind his back and with his legs apart. And he looked up at this sort of green-faced young rating and basically just smiled at him and winked, because there were these incredible sailors in the Royal Navy. So no, it was truly, truly horrific. Patrol White, as it was called, or the Northern Patrol. And that's what the cruisers did. Very unglamorous, and gave London's structure a very bad hammering, actually.
No, definitely. And those kind of stories about the crews are important, because I'm assuming a ship with that history, there were some people on board who'd been with the ship for some time. You know, the war films always have the grizzled, you know, senior guy down the engine room who's been there, seen it and done it. And that's ultimately what a ship is. It's the phasing in of the new people with the old guard, and the camaraderie and the family nature of that. I mean, it's that when you're facing adversity, but you're facing it together as a family, I suppose it's slightly more easy to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, a ship with 700 people, even one with 200 or 300, it is a town, and not everybody knows each other, because they all have different messes, and so they know each other in their messes, and will go on a run ashore with people they know. So they don't know everybody. But I would say that the core people, and I found this myself with the modern Royal Navy as well, the people that in London stayed for 5 or 6 years were the engineers, the engine room people, the artificers, the people that ran the machinery of the vessel. So they were with London from 1939 right through to the end of the war, because those guys knew how the ship worked. And I visited a Royal Navy ship in the Arabian Gulf back in 2008, HMS Chatham, which was by that time 20 odd years plus. And I met sailors aboard there who were in the engineering department, who had been aboard for 8 years. So other people, you know, even just 15 years ago, that was still going on. So other people even back then, who might have moved through after a year or two or 18 months, they stayed. And it was the same with HMS London, because they knew, and any other warship, most warships, because in World War II, because they knew the idiosyncrasies of the vessel, what would keep the thing going, what you needed to do to repair it. A bit like Scotty down in Star Trek. Can you get more speed, you know, more warp speed? So I suppose the captain of London would just ring down for more knots when they had to chase a German ship or tackle heavy seas. And so the chief petty officers, in particular, the warrant officers, whoever, they were the guys that really knew how to squeeze the most out of the ship. So you're right. But the mixes of Royal Navy crews in cruisers and any other ship were hostilities only ratings, who came from various backgrounds and weren't necessarily the fully rounded or disciplined sailor that you might get in other vessels who had been in the Navy before the war. So it was a mix, I would say. And sometimes those guys were a bit hard to handle and would get into fights ashore or go AWOL. But it was the crew the ship's company was one that kind of knitted together. And often, and this is something I found out about battleships in World War II, they might even fight other crews of other battleships. I don't know if London did that with other cruisers. So yeah, you're right. It's a family, it's a team, it's a big one, and it can be a bit dysfunctional. But I think when it knits together, it has key players who help keep it running.
And it's when you've built up that camaraderie, then when you're facing the challenges that the London did, and we can do PQ17 at some point. But do you want to do the Tirpitz first? Is that chronologically correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, Tirpitz. I mean the home fleet, which London was part of, did try and trap Tirpitz or lure Tirpitz out when Tirpitz, that's Hitler's last remaining full battleship, lurking in a field like that picture says. In March 1942, they thought they would try and lure Tirpitz out and catch her and then attack like they had with Bismarck, because Admiral Tovey was still commander of the home fleet, and he was the man who was in command of the home fleet when they sank Bismarck. So he thought that he would try the same with Tirpitz, lure Tirpitz out, and then use torpedo bombers. By then, albacore torpedo bombers rather than swordfish to cripple Tirpitz and then get her. But that didn't work. So Tirpitz remained lurking in the fjords or the field, the Alton Fjord. There, I know they moved around a bit, but Tirpitz was banned by Hitler because Hitler was paranoid about his capital ships being sunk, especially after Bismarck in May 1941, and so he banned the Kriegsmarine again from sending out the last capital ship. But then again, when a tempting convoy came round the top of Norway, the North Cape on the way to Murmansk, then of course the German Navy would try and attack. And that's what happened with PQ17.
Yeah, and we've got a couple other photos of this painting or drawing. That again is interesting of the conditions on board. So explain what we're looking at.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to talk to, and you know what, I didn't put his name on there, but it's in the book, to a young rating. He wasn't a young rating by the time I spoke to him. He was an old man, but I had a good chat with him about things. And he sent me those sketches. There's more than one. I think there's 2 or 3 in the book. They're in black and white. So this is the first time anyone except me and the guy that did it has it's been seen in color. So what you've got there is a very stark illustration of how a Royal Navy cruiser, and I'm sure others like battleships, were run in some instances. So what you have there is you have your ratings with the flash gear. That's what they call anti-flash hoods and gauntlets there, so that when let's say some flash came down into that compartment, the cotton gauntlets and the hoods would burn off rather than the skin. That's the idea. And I think they've probably got their gas mask there in the green bags. But the guy going down the hatch, right, so that's like an ante-room for another compartment down below. And I'd have to look at the book to tell you exactly which one it is. But that guy who's closing the hatch is being sent down, probably with a few others, to sit in there, I think because he had to operate some piece of machinery. And this is at combat stations. And when they go to combat stations, then all the clips, as they call them, on the hatches are put on. I've been in warships in action stations myself, so I've seen it. But in that particular instance, in that cruiser, they weren't going to allow anybody out of that compartment he's going into, even if the ship was hit and looked like it was going to go down. So that is a Royal Marine in his khaki there with his flash gear on, with a rifle. And if that sailor breaks during action, during combat, either due to a hit or because the sound of a battle inside a steel warship, as you can imagine, is quite terrifying in itself if there are near misses, because you can hear every thump and you don't know what's going on. So you're psychologically going to be worked on. And although they made tannoy broadcasts to tell people what's going on, you can imagine the psychological pressure. So if that sailor broke and tried to get out of that compartment, then that Royal Marine was there basically to make sure he gets back down in there and they don't all panic. And I imagine those chaps there, in fact, I think it's in the book, are waiting for their turn down in the hole. So it's pretty grim, but that's the reality in a sketch. Yeah.
And of course, everybody's safety is dependent on everybody else staying in their compartments, because it's safe. I mean, and that's the stress and the pressure again of being in that location, hoping that where you are, if there is action, isn't in the bit that's hit, and then your compartment being the one that's sacrificed. we're not going to go into what happens
No.
when ships go down, but when the ships go down, there's lots of loss of life. In World War II, and it's tragic death. I mean, all deaths are tragic, but there's a drowning, and anyway, it's a horrible rabbit hole to go down. But let's go back to we're going to getting on towards PQ17, and it's an infamous convoy. It's been discussed on the channel in passing, and we've had a show dedicated to it. But take us to the London's role in it.
Yeah. Okay, so the London was a flagship of the first cruiser squadron. And so the way it worked was, and again, it's all in the book, and I know you've had your deep discussion on it, so I'll keep it very simple, is that you would have the home fleet battleships still under Admiral Tovey at a distance. So they would be a fair distance from a convoy as it went on its way. And there would be another one coming back from Russia as well to Russia. And then there would be a close escort of armed trawlers and frigates and ships like that with the convoy, but there would also be a cruiser force. And so London was in command as the flagship of Rear Admiral Louis Hamilton of the cruiser force, and that was composed of I think some American destroyers, an American cruiser, and a couple of in general terms, a couple of British cruisers. And they were closer, but not right. They were about 5 or 6 miles or 10 miles, whatever it was, from the PQ17 convoys that went on its merry way. And the idea there, of course, was that, let's say Tirpitz comes out, and they did fear, and there was in fact a concerted operation. The Kriegsmarine top brass persuaded Hitler to let them have a go at a PQ17, this big convoy, including a fair few American ships. And so the idea was Tirpitz and other vessels like the Hipper, the Scheer, the Lutzow would sally forth and deliver a death blow to this Arctic convoy. And so that plan didn't quite work out for the Germans. And so the one ship left that might do it was Tirpitz. And in London, at the Admiralty, the first Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound was getting all sorts of intelligence feeds about, was Tirpitz still in the fjord? Was Tirpitz not in the fjord? And he had Admiral Tovey, who was somewhere to the west of Bear Island, who had his own ideas about what should happen if Tirpitz came out. And he was in communication with Rear Admiral Hamilton in London, and so was the Admiralty in London. So Rear Admiral Hamilton was sort of torn between the two, and Tovey was determined there would be no scatter order for the convoy, because the idea to protect the convoy was to keep it together, and then if something happens, you keep the close escort with it, and you might send the cruiser escort to hold off the Tirpitz. And of course, they have to protect the convoy from U-boats and German bombers. And then the home fleet would move in and destroy Tirpitz. And what happened was, due to terrible confusion and various other things, it was thought Tirpitz had come out when she hadn't. And the Germans were slightly scared by London, her silhouette, due to that major rebuild, to the Germans looked like a King George V class battleship. So they thought that the cruiser escort was being led by, or there was a close escort from a battleship. So they changed their mind in simple terms about sending Tirpitz out. However, Admiral Pound, the first Sea Lord, decided that it was too great a risk to allow Tirpitz to get in among the convoys. So he ordered the convoy to scatter, and then the cruiser squadron, led by HMS London, then turned around, and the convoy, as it scattered, thought they would be left to their own devices and deserted by the cruiser squadron. And so did the American ships in the squadron as well. They thought the British were running away from Tirpitz, but in fact, London and the cruiser squadron actually thought they were going, along with some of the close escort, thought they were going to fight Tirpitz and were prepared to sacrifice themselves to protect the convoy. But of course, they didn't find Tirpitz, and as the sea miles went by under the hull, the mood got ever darker, and people got ever more disgruntled with the fact they'd been ripped away from PQ17. And as you know, I think 20 ships got sunk, and the U-boats and the Luftwaffe devastated that convoy. And in fact, some of the convoys ships ran themselves aground rather than be sunk on up there on an island or something. It's all in the book, obviously. It's very intricate, but that's the simple story. So afterwards, morale in London, and it was like a black stain upon London's reputation, and they're very, very angry, and they're very angry with the Americans were very angry with them until they understood, the American cruiser Wichita in particular understood that they too had been the victim of circumstance, and that the British weren't to blame. But there were fights with merchant Navy sailors who thought that the convoy had been deserted, and Admiral Hamilton was most disgruntled, and he was the one who got blamed, I think, the most, and for doing it, when in fact it wasn't his fault. So it was an almighty cock-up, as you know from having.
And it's as you said, a catalogue of things went wrong. It wasn't one single thing. And when we talked about it with Drachenfell, it was that idea as well that so much has been said about the benefits the Allies had of ultra and information and signals intelligence generally. And yes, it was a huge asset throughout the war, but it wasn't perfect. It was fallible. There were sometimes wrong conclusions drawn because, and sometimes in that case, it can lead to massive disaster. So when we talk about the advantage the Allies had, it's not always the it usually was, but intelligence when you're is a big factor, and it's that middle part of the war where things can often go the wrong way.
And I think that the fact, I couldn't recite it in too much detail, but in the book I went into it. I spent weeks looking at it, so I've gone deep into the whole affair in the complexity and all the various things. But the thing that stands out for me, and we're talking about HMS London, it relates to what you've just said, is that you can have all the code breakers, you can have all the human intelligence there, and you've got Pound and Tovey and all the rest of it. But in fact, you could say that the thing that caused it, and there was no one cause, was the fact that a German recce aircraft, when Tirpitz was going to come out and preparing to come out, and I think came out a little bit again. I'm fairly it's been a few years since I did that, but the Tirpitz was on her way getting ready to go, and the thing that stopped her was just that sighting of this mystery ship, which is the only one in the Royal Navy, the only cruiser in the Royal Navy that had that rebuild with a great big huge bridge and looked very square, as it were, unlike any other cruiser in the Royal Navy. And they thought it was King George V or the Duke of York, or King George V at that time, I think. And so they decided that it was a battleship. So that was it. Tirpitz wasn't going to come out. So it's just a sighting, a fleeting glance from a Luftwaffe recce aircraft. So.
And it's those little tiny moments that have a huge, great impact, and that's the thing, that all the amount of war trials and planning and preparation, and in theory this should happen, and if this happens, we will do this, and we will stay. It can all just get thrown by one mistake from one bit of information. But that ends, or as far as our presentation is concerned, this part of the London's history. We're going to move off distinctly further south, because there's more history to go, and we're off to I'll let you hand over. We're off to, there's a photo of Alexandria here, so back to you.
Well, that's a photo. The funny thing is, that's a photo, a taster for London of more temperate climates, which I suppose was a great relief to a crew, and especially those people like the artificers who'd been in the ship, a cold, empty, damp ship, for years, could now go to the Mediterranean. But they were sent to the Mediterranean to carry, in late 1943, to carry a sword of Stalingrad, I think it was called. Yeah, it was called that. Again, it's in the book, to Alexandria, because what was going to happen was that Churchill would present this sword to Stalin as a mark of respect or a tribute to Russia's great victory at Stalingrad. And so this sword was carried aboard London in this very secure compartment. And I've got a bit in the book about this. And this young Royal Marine officer was put in charge of its safety, this bejeweled sword. And unfortunately, he lost, or somebody put the keys to this compartment out of his sight, and he didn't know where they were. And he had horrific image in his head of this secure area being broken open and a acetylene torch or explosive fuse to get at the Stalingrad sword, so it could be handed over to Stalin later on, and actually destroying it in the process. But fortunately, he found the keys. So the main thing that London did was to carry that ceremonial sword. But after that, she went back to the home fleet. And after a while, after another refit, because she kept having repairs and refits to try and put right the defects in her structure, she was ordered to go and join what was then known as the Eastern Fleet, based in the Indian Ocean out of Ceylon, Sri Lanka as it's known today. And so London would then be part of the British side, and there is a bombardment that happened more than a year later out there. London would be part of what became known as the East Indies Fleet, which would incorporate aircraft carriers, including an American one for a short while. And their job was basically, while the American Navy obviously was taking the war to the Japanese across the Central Pacific and helping out with MacArthur's drive, through the Philippines, the Royal Navy, until it assembled its British Pacific Fleet later, had the East Indies Fleet to work on attacking Japanese troop positions and their oil refineries, which were a key part of the Japanese war effort, to feed the Japanese war effort, and basically bombarding various locations in what is today Indonesia with battleships, and London, and also attacking them with carrier aircraft as part of training to take the war to the Japanese in the Pacific. So London was part of the escort group for those task groups, which worked up and down various parts of Indonesia, attacking Japanese targets. And that is one of the probably she did more than one bombardment. That's the main bombardment that London took part in. That's just a sketch I asked somebody to do for the book based on a photograph. So London got to fire her guns in anger out there. And I suppose that was really the finale for her career in World War II, certainly. Apart from taking the surrender at Sabang, where the Japanese came aboard London and were saluted by Royal Marine Honour Guard. I think you've got a picture there of that. And went aboard to talk about how to hand over. In fact, that Royal Marine officer standing there with his sword is the I think he was called Furlong. He was the chap. He wrote to me, actually, and I put a bit in at the end of the book, a new bit in at the end in the appendices of his story about the Stalingrad sword. And he is the chap that nearly had a bit of a terrible time trying to get that memento or tribute to Stalin out of his compartment. But he's there leading the honour guard for the Japanese coming aboard to surrender at Sabang.
I'm glad you mentioned the history of these in the East Indies there, because again, it's come up so often. When we get to the Pacific in the latter part of the war, we're kind of following the American island hopping. That's where the attention is. That's where the press is. It's where still the interest is with the books and things like that. But the Royal Navy are there, along with the Dutch Navy, Australian Navy, etc., etc. And these jobs may not have been as massive as what was happening elsewhere, but they were integral in part of it. And I'm reminded of the show I did fairly recently about the kamikaze hunters and this Pacific fleet that the British were assembling. In the end, it was a bit it was too late, because the war ended abruptly because of atomic bombs, and this fleet that the British had been building and didn't end up being quite as important as it could have been had things taken a different turn and the atomic bombs not been used. So again, this idea we have of people's attention being in one area at the detriment of the other areas that there's still action, but maybe not quite as important or not quite as well known, and therefore second league in terms of people's understanding. But it is important to understand that the Royal Navy were all over the place, and somewhere like London can be involved in something really pivotal one moment, and then in a theatre where the tension is just somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that part of the war was that, I mean, I touched on this in another book called The Deadly Trade, which has covered the submarine war in the Pacific and also this part of the world. It was divided into two parts. And so for submarines, certainly, the British would stay, let's say, to the west of Indonesia, just to keep it simple, in the Indian Ocean. And the Americans would mainly prey on, although British submarines did go there as well, on the other side and into the Pacific. So they had more targets, because the Japanese were basically whittled down. And so even British submarines had very little to attack. So they had to go using Australia into the other side to try and get targets. But I think the British Pacific Fleet did have a major role, a supporting role to play in the end game with Japan. I mean, those the fleet carriers there did carry out some very important work. But compared to the American assembly of power, sea power carrier groups, it was small, but it was quite for Britain. It was the biggest strike force of carriers, or the biggest combat fleet assembled ever, I think, in modern warfare. But in the East Indies Fleet, they were in the those weren't the most modern battleships, the most modern carriers, and the most modern destroyers and cruisers went to the British Pacific Fleet, and it was ships like London and others that maybe were. I mean, London was fine, but not as advanced as others, even other cruisers. So they were kept to do this tidying up. I mean, even then, it was an important job to take the surrender of various garrisons, and also to keep the peace, because of course some places were in quite a state of chaos, and some of London's Marines and sailors had to go ashore to try and keep the peace as well.
Indeed, which will kind of bring us to our post-war era, because that's one of the things that we're going down a massive rabbit hole of what the Britain's intentions were in that part of the world and what the US intentions or lack of them were in that part of the world. But this is an interesting thing, obviously the Christmas menu in 1945 and signatures there. So just tell us about that, then we'll go into the post-war era.
Yeah, I mean, during my time, I've come across many of these things. I've got a great one from HMS Rodney, and they did feed them well. I mean, it's important, morale, no matter what else is happening. I mean, that's why that cook in the Arctic kept going no matter what. And it's the same today as it ever was. Food, morale for, young men, and they were young men, hundreds of them. You've got to give them good food. And everybody gets around, the mess table or in the wardroom or wherever. And they had it wasn't quite the same as today. They had individual messes where the sailors would go and get their food from the central galley, as it were, and bring it back. But I mean, you can see the food there is pretty good. So if you can imagine, those sailors have been away from home a long time, and were there doing distinctly unglamorous jobs, thinking they wanted to get back to their families. They'd met some prisoners of war, and they had them on board the ship actually at Singapore from the Burma Railway. They'd help those people. They'd kept the peace. They'd taken surrenders, so they were still out there east of Suez, as they would have called it. And so giving them a good Christmas dinner, particularly after coming through the war, as they did. Not all of them, because obviously parts of the crew will change, but it's pretty good. I like the look of it myself.
It's the force meat stuffing I'm concerned about. Is that kind of sweepings from the floor?
I don't know. I like a bit of gammon.
The gammon said some of the companies mentioned the gammon, and that's some locally procured pig from I don't know, but the force meat stuffing is my only question mark.
Yeah, I mean, breakfast looks fairly standard. Looks pretty good. I mean, kidney. I don't think people these days would have kidney for breakfast. But then you've got your Christmas dinner, and then Christmas cake, fruit, gold roast pork, pickles. I mean, it's a full-on 4 courses, isn't it? So
it is. It's a good meal. But
obviously working hard.
and it is reminding us, because that's Christmas 45. So some people, the war has been over in Europe for a year, a good 6 months by this point. So a long time at sea, a long time away from home. But which brings us to the post-war era, because again, I said at the beginning, we're breaking our rule and we're going to post-war era. But that is, if there was a channel devoted to the next 5 years, it would be really interesting, because a lot of changes. There's civil wars in countries. There's the breaking up or the continued breaking up of the British Empire. Israel gets formed in 48, etc., etc. So take us through HMS London's kind of complicated role in what is effectively a very complicated political period for the British in those next few years.
Yeah, I mean, she's there at Singapore, so Singapore would carry on being a host to British warships until the 70s, and so that was non-contentious. And then obviously we won't go into it, but there were tensions with Indonesia and all the rest of it. But the main focus, I would say, in the late 1940s was what was happening with China.
So topical.
Yeah. Yeah,
again.
but I mean, without going into it too much, they say that the Second World War actually began in China, with Japan invading Manchuria and then moving further. And so, and one of the things that we had prior to the Second World War was the Japanese conducting terrible atrocities at Nanking and capturing that city as well. So Nanking remained a focus of activity because what was happening by the late 1940s was that the communists under Mao Zedong, who had been in an uneasy alliance in the Second World War with the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, were now staging basically a takeover, to keep it simple. But there were many thousands of British nationals left in China, and of course Britain had a major colony at Hong Kong. And what would happen was that British warships would go up the Yangtze River to act as guard ships, dropping anchor, because it's a very wide, very long river, would drop anchor at Nanking to oversee and safeguard and guarantee the security of British nationals and probably other nationals as well, international nationals. And so London went up there a few times and dropped anchor. So it was something they did. They would go up from Shanghai up there and do that. And the famous ship became famous. It was a sloop called the Amethyst, which went up there, and that's a picture for there, and went up river to relieve another vessel called the Consort, a destroyer, as guard ship at Nanking, and that was in April 1949. But what happened was, although the communists, in fact, both sides were not supposed to fire on the British ships, and they would, unlike that shot you've got there, they would make sure they displayed Union Jacks and made it clear that they were British. What happened was Amethyst was fired upon by communist artillery and was seriously damaged and ran aground a place called Rose Island. And then the Consort tried to come to her aid. I think she'd gone downriver and was coming back. And again, this is all in some detail in the book, and tried to help. But the Consort was attacked and came off worse. So then they decided what they would do is send the London and another smaller warship up to try and prize the Amethyst out of her captivity. And so, there's some of the young men aboard London before they went up further up the river on 4-inch guns, which are the secondary armament on the ship, because the main guns are the 8-inch. So London goes up, and they knew, and that's another sketch which I got commissioned just to show what it was like for London. She went up at high speed, and I said in the book that it was, and they knew it was a daft lesson, a daft mission, because you had all the communist artillery on the shore, 4-inch guns, cannons, anti-aircraft cannons, and they knew that they would likely face opposition. They hoped that the Union Jacks would do the trick, but Mao Zedong's communists were not having any of that. So what happened was London, I say this in the book, went on a mission against the odds, illogical in operational terms, and trying to steam past determined and well-trained shore batteries. And what they did was they opened fire, prolonged fire, and even the anti-aircraft guns punctured London and caused a fair amount of damage. And it was probably the most heated combat that London was in throughout her entire career, because during the Second World War she hadn't had anything like that. And so, and apparently the Chinese were using 75mm and 105mm caliber projectiles, and I don't think she sustained too many hits from those. It was, as I say, mainly the cannons, and there were quite a number of casualties, and that's a hit on the bows, and it became known as, she failed to get the Amethyst, and that was in April 1949. It became known as the Yangtze Incident. And I just quote something to you just from the captain when he was about to take the decision to turn around. So it says in the book, London was 19 miles from Amethyst. A shell had burst over London's bridge, and just as the decision was taken to turn around, and this decision was taken by the captain, and it was noted that damage to instruments and communications on the bridge was severe. The captain was in doubt, he said, as to whether he was still in control of the ship. And he said that he considered the passage at high speed under heavy fire could not be controlled from the emergency conning position abaft of the ship, i.e. further back in the ship. And he was in no doubt that the time for withdrawal had arrived. And he said, I ordered the wheel to hard a starboard and the starboard engine to full astern. So London was under fire for 48 minutes over a period of 3 hours, which is a lot. And she suffered 13 killed, 14 seriously wounded, 40 lightly wounded. And the exposed 4-inch gun crews and people giving them ammunition were the ones that took a lot of the casualties. But she kept firing and went back down to Shanghai, where she buried some of her dead. There was funeral services and licked her wounds. And in fact, this made world headlines. There were 15 people killed in London. 46 people were killed altogether in Amethyst and the Consort and the cruiser. But there were no fatalities in another ship which came up behind London. So London fired, just for a bit of statistical information, fired 155 8-inch shells, 449 4-inch, and 2,265 rounds of what they call close-range ammunition, so cannons and other things. So it was the Navy did it as a moral thing. They couldn't leave people trapped. But in the end, what happened with the Amethyst several months later, was she sneaked out and got back down herself. And of course, there was a famous film made about that as well. So quite an episode. And that was really the end of London's, career. She later went home and was paid off. And by early 1950, had been sent to that's her arriving home, that picture, in late 1949. And so London was sent to Barrow-in-Furness to be broken up. And that was the end of the London.
And it won't be quite the end of our presentation because we'll do questions. And thank you very much. It's really good. And you can see, viewers, why we had to include the 1949 history there, because not including it would somehow have been, unfair to the crew. Because I was going to ask you, how many of the crew in 49 were World War II veterans, or had there been a lot of changeover of personnel?
Not many. I mean, if you look at that picture of those guys there, I mean, you see how old they are. I mean, they'll be. Some of them might be teenage. They'll be early 20s. They are. I mean, my dad was a national serviceman in the RAF. I mean, I can't remember when they must have started it straight away, mustn't they? Somebody will probably tell me that. But they probably might be national servicemen because, of course, everybody else would have gone home, been demobbed. So no, I would say that majority of them would not have been in World War II. There were people in World War II, and one of the people that was aboard London at the time was a guy called Tommy Catlow, and he was quite an extraordinary officer, and he had actually been a prisoner in Colditz. So some of them had. I'm just double checking that because 20 years since I did it. I'm pretty sure I got that right. Tommy Catlow. I mean, I've found the bit where he's where I've got quite a bit on him. In fact, I corresponded with him as well, so he gave me quite a few of his memories of it. So he played a key role in keeping the ship running. So he was a prisoner from Colditz, but he was an officer, a career officer who'd been in the Navy a lot. And I think you would have found that the senior ratings, warrant officers, chiefs, and others would have been with World War II experience.
Yeah,
but the majority of them,
but lots of national service, as someone said.
So
keep us a little bit up to date with what happened with the next versions, and then we'll do a few questions if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't another HMS London until the 1960s, and that was a guided county-class guided missile destroyer, and she served. Didn't see any hot wars as such, but did serve in the Cold War in the Black Sea, and also supporting what they call the confrontation with Indonesia. And she that London is the one before this one. This is the last London Type 22 frigate, the one that I knew. I've been to see quite a few Type 22 frigates around the world, the Middle East, the Adriatic. But I went to see a couple of times in that HMS London up to Murmansk and Archangel in 1991, 50th anniversary of the convoys. And that picture in the left, that's a photo I took on the flight deck of the pilot of the Lynx watching a Russian destroyer, because it was the time of the hardliners coup. And so when we sailed up from Rosyth and went around the north, we had no idea if the Cold War was back on. And so the Russians would send over aircraft every now and again, and we weren't really in communication with them. And then this destroyer turned up, which is what you see there. And then kept at a distance. But then in the end, it was clear the Cold War between the navies was over. So that picture in the top right shows a frigate called the Gromke that passed by London in the foreground, which had been flagship of the Royal Navy task group in the Desert Storm War, the operation to liberate Kuwait. And that's a real scene. In fact, I helped the artist compose that because I'm one of the tiny figures on top of the bridge there. And so those are Sukhoi jets that came in and then climbed very steep above us. So that was the actual greeting. And both crews cheered. And you can see that in the bottom right. That's another photo by me from that position on top of the bridge of the admiral on board on the right and the captain, Mark Stanhope, there saluting and saying hello, as did the sailors of the ship, as the Russians cheered us. That was the end of the Cold War, which has sadly now gone back the other way. And that final bit is the London's badge in a local pub, which I was in last Christmas, and I couldn't believe as I was working on finishing the paperback, or because I had to revise it again in the new year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I was nearly finished it at the end of last 21, before we had to revise it yet again. That was the London's badge. That's the red sword of London, and that's above the bar in the pub in Stonehouse and Plymouth. And there is going to be a new London, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the 2030s. Will be a new anti-submarine frigate. But that London, the London you see in the top right there of that slide, serves on in the Romanian Navy and has been out at sea recently, and is also mentioned in the book. So not called London anymore, but out there with the Romanian Navy and part of NATO in the Black Sea. That's it. That's the current story of the Londons.
And in your experience when you were there in 91, how knowledgeable were people on the ship of the histories of the previous incarnations of the London?
Yeah, I mean, the whole, I mean, this is the interesting thing about that. The whole thing was agreed between Mikhail Gorbachev and John Major before the attempted coup in Moscow, the hardliners coup in August 91. So the two of them decided that, as you know, the Cold War was over, and in the aftermath of Desert Storm, it was good for London's crew to have a nice trip like that, but very appropriate, that they would have this convoy called named the same as the first convoy escort or convoys in 1941, Operation Dervish. So it was called Operation Dervish, and it was all on, and it was a big diplomatic thing. It was a big diplomacy thing between the UK and the Soviet Union, as it still was, to show the Cold War at sea, or the Cold War was over. So then the sailors were well aware of the previous London's history. That's why London was chosen. There were leaflets and there were explanations given as to the history behind it and why London had been chosen. And in fact, London was the first British warship down into Murmansk and Archangel in 50 years.
Wow.
And so it was, for me, you know, an amazing experience. There's a chapter on it in the book, to go down into the inlet, the Kola Inlet, where all those ships have been in World War II. But also, you know, if you'd watched The Hunt for Red October, like I did, you know, a year or so earlier, to go into the real lair of the Russian Navy and to go and see it, you know, in its decayed state, as most of it was at the end of the Cold War, up on the beach, then to go into Murmansk, have a run ashore there, and then retrace the steps all the way around into the White Sea and up that river there, first time in 50 years. And people then in Archangel certainly were delighted and to see the Royal Navy there. And there were veterans as well, World War II veterans. Some of the veterans were there as well at both places. And it was a fantastic time. And the Russians were great hosts. And it's so sad now, this is something I remark upon in the book, that we've now gone back, you know, 30 years later. It's come full circle to a confrontation, and including in the Barents Sea, because Royal Navy warships and American and French and Norwegian warships and submarines, I'm pretty sure, are now back up there shadowing the Russians, and the Russians are shadowing us. And, you know, it's been happening throughout the Ukraine war. There's been kind of navies watching each other very tensely. And that's the end of the book. One of the things I put at the end of the book, they had to revise in 2022. Yeah. So, well, they knew about it. Yeah, very much.
Good. The echoes of history, it's not so much repeating itself, but the echoes of things seeming similar to previous things. We've got a couple of questions. You've kind of touched on this, but just to run down, Bobby's asking, apart from the structural changes because of the leaking and the looks, how did the London change during the war in terms of, was it upgunned? Was it up armored? What were the changes?
Yeah, I mean, I did a bit of a. What they would do is fairly early on. In fact, in the first major rebuild, they gave London the newfangled gunnery control radar, and then she had 2 or 3 refits in Newcastle, in Rosyth mainly, and so she got gunnery control and surface search radar. And also, anti-aircraft guns. And when she was at Rosyth before going to the Far East, even more of those. And would also, I mean, that was the main thing that she got. But the armor belts and the weight they put into her gave her continual problems with flexing. And I think, and again, you know, I'm sure I wrote this in the book, there was a bit of welding went on as well, rather than rivets in some areas. So that made London quite brittle. And if you imagine with all those seas, heavy seas, it kind of flexed her, and she had continual problem with water feed for the boilers and with drinking water tanks and being contaminated. So it was a pretty serious problem for her. But it's quite clear why they didn't do any more county-class cruisers, because of quite a few of them, because they realised they might as well just run them as they were, and it wasn't a great idea to to do this rebuild.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. There's another question now. Just Alan Burt is asking, what type of speed and tonnage was she?
Right. So I think London could do, against in the book for sure, but it's up to, I think, 32 knots, which is pretty fast for a cruiser at her best. Obviously, they won't always attain that as they get old. And but she had 9,850 tons standard before the rebuild and 13,315 tons full load. That means with all the fuel and all the ammunition aboard. And she was 632 feet 8 inches in length with a beam of 66 feet and a draft of 20 feet 9 inches. But the rebuild, the not very good rebuild, meant she was without all the ammo and and all the other stuff on board, the oil, full load of oil, etc. She was 11,000 tons standard and deep load of 14,500. So you can see it's a fair bit of weight to put into
definitely.
That size.
Paraphrasing a couple of questions on the Arctic convoys, when the docked in places like Archangel, how much interaction was there between the crew and the locals? How much turnaround time do they have in port? Was only a few limited personnel allowed off, or did a lot of them go off? And if they were, what did they say? What did they remark about?
I would, again, 20 years ago, I'd have to really double check, but I'm pretty sure that although I went to the Soviet Union and the other people of London did in 91, London never went she went up the river and picked up the diplomatic party that had been in Moscow talking to Stalin and brought them back. But she didn't spend any time, as far as I'm aware, alongside. I mean, there was nowhere to be alongside there, but in Murmansk, I mean, it's too early for that to happen. But I can tell you from other books I've written, like on HMS Rodney in particular, the warship, and also submarines that were based, because some British submarines were based in Murmansk. Royal Navy warships went into Murmansk. Their sailors did go ashore, found it pretty grim. The Soviet authorities did not like any fraternization. They tried to keep them away from local people and the local sailors. And they did go ashore and they did sort of swap things for cigarettes and things like that. And I think they sometimes, if they were at anchor in the Murmansk Inlet, they'd be there for a week or two, possibly at a time, depending on the weather. And the other thing we mustn't forget about up north was, of course, which would pertain to PQ17, was you get almost constant daylight in the summer months up there. So, I mean, there would have been an urge to go ashore at various times. So they did go ashore, but it was a pretty frosty reception. I'm sure there was
that. And yes,
it wasn't permitted. Yeah, sorry.
My last question really is going to be, and I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because we had you on talking about Arnhem. Is that you write about the Navy, you write about ships, but actually you're writing about the people first who happen to be on board ships, because I don't read a lot of shipping books, but they can get a bit techie. They can get a bit specification sheets and improvements and measurements and drafts. It frankly, it loses me a little bit. I want to know about people. So is it the people that drive you first, more so than actually the armaments and the technical data?
Yeah, I mean, I put in as, I mean, this is why, you know, sometimes, apart from the distance of time, sometimes I sound a bit woolly, is because I do all the technical detail. You know, if you're writing about a ship like HMS Warspite, which I've done, you've got to do all that because of how important that was. And London, you know, I put in as much as I needed to, but it's the people that matter. It's their experiences. And that's the main thing about the books, whether it's World War One, because I, you know, obviously did that as well, the Cold War, and World War II. And that's why in the series I did 4 books which are about particular ships, but it's all about the people and the main, you know, the stars of it. And this is why I give so much space to longer quotes. Some of the quotes are quite long, as they were in the Arnhem book, which was the same sort of thing. Not all my books are like that, but these particular books, it's the people. I want to give them a bit more space, because let's face it, if you're a junior rating who was a junior rating 17 years old on the Arctic convoys in World War II in 1941, and you had those experiences, you won't, like a senior officer, have written a memoir, and many senior officers didn't write memoirs as well, or even junior officers, but you will have written letters and you will have your memories, and you'll have hoovered up things. So to be able to interview them as I did for all those 4 books, 3 of the books, the 4th one was on HMS Victory. I didn't interview anybody from 200 years ago. No, I'm not quite that old. But that was the main point of them, was to get the human in, you know, the human in the machinery. And those amazing, I mean, I haven't recounted them here, but the amazing, funny and tragic stories, you know, terrible stories, but also very amusing stories of those people. And to have met them, we're talking about writing to hundreds, interviewing dozens, on the phone and in person, and going to meet them in their homes, etc., etc. Royal Marines, sailors, whoever served on boards, sometimes soldiers who travelled in them, was the main thing. And so that is what the book is about, and including the modern warship as well, the more modern warships too. Yeah, people.
Oh, brilliant. So, what? Obviously, your day job is as editor, but what are your future World War II projects in terms of writing? Are there any?
There are lots of there's several proposals. I mean, I've just sat them there strategically. I've just had new paperback editions with a new publisher for my book, for the Arnhem book, which you mentioned, and the Bismarck book is out next month. I've got the advanced paperback sitting there, but those aren't new books and they're not revised. They're just now shop paperbacks, so they'll get out there in the shops, not print on demand, not just digital. So I'm delighted that Canelo Publishing are putting them out there. That's, you know, London's out there as a paperback, and I'm very pleased with that. It's expanded, revised, updated, and I do have proposals, including one for a not strictly naval topic, World War II, and others I've got, you know, but it's waiting. You do I don't know how much you've talked about this on here, but you do the proposals, you then do the detail of some of the chapters, you do sample chapters, and then you go through this process of pitching it and finding out if somebody wants it. So I'm waiting as part of that process to see if I can crack on with one. And I do have one in particular I really want to do, and that'll be mainly not naval, but will have a naval aspect to it.
Oh, you got me intrigued now. But I mean, I love your Arnhem book. I mean, your Arnhem book is one of the classics. And
great, thanks.
And so anyway, we will bring things to an end. Folks, we've got one more show tomorrow. Michael Wellham is on talking about Navy or Special Forces divers, not just British, but around the world, but particularly a focus on World War II. And Iain, thanks, and we'll see you again on the channel. Good luck with everything. The links to the paperback edition are in the description below, folks, and as are links to Twitter account and his website, etc., etc. So go and fill your boots looking at them. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks,
bye.